I still remember the exact sound of the stapler echoing off the quiet suburban street when I posted the very first evacuation sign on my fence. It was a crisp morning, the sky tinged with faint oranges from the rising sun. Normally, the only thing you'd hear at that hour might be a dog barking or the distant hum of a lawnmower. But that day, it was the sure click of metal on wood. And in hindsight, that single moment foreshadowed more trouble than I ever could have imagined. A row of pines edged my property, and beyond them, rolling hills covered in dry brush. For weeks now, local meteorologists had warned of a potential wildfire threat. Several small blazes had already sparked throughout the region, with one raging just a few miles away. The city council and the fire department began urging residents to make plans for emergency evacuation in case the flames drew closer. I'd volunteered to help coordinate our neighborhood's official route. After working with the fire marshal's office to create a clear, step-by-step path out of our labyrinthine cul-de-sac, I proudly printed out bright yellow signs, each labeled Emergency Evacuation Route in bold black letters. I had no idea that these signs, an honest effort to keep people safe, would trigger the wrath of our local homeowners association's self-appointed enforcer. The woman neighbors privately called HOA Karen. Not that her real name was Karen, but her behavior was everything that meme implies: overbearing, self-righteous, and unrelentingly intrusive. She'd appointed herself neighborhood queen long before I moved in, and many told me to just don't get on her bad side. As it turned out, I'd soon be right in the crosshairs of her iron-fisted approach to community standards. What I didn't realize at the time was that my signs would drive Karen absolutely insane and spark a slow-building, full-blown neighborhood war. So, if you want to see how this ends, stay right where you are and listen until the story's final moment. Trust me, you won't believe the twists and turns ahead. My name is Dana Morrison. I'm a 30-something journalist who recently relocated from the city to a quieter life in the suburbs. I was excited to have a yard big enough for my golden retriever, Scout, to run around in. And I looked forward to forging new friendships with neighbors who seemed so cordial during my initial house hunting visits. When the threat of a nearby wildfire became too big to ignore, I received an urgent email from the local fire marshal's office. They were recommending we all post official instructions for evacuation, or at least distribute them among neighbors. They also suggested physically mapping out the route so everyone could follow it in case smoke or flames made it tough to navigate. That's where I got the idea of the wooden signs. Some folks planned to rely on group texts or posts on the neighborhood's social media page, but with the possibility of power or internet outages in an emergency, tangible markers felt safer. So, I carefully hammered them into the ground along sidewalks and corners, always on my own property or on easements the city had deemed permissible for public safety notices. I managed to hang 5 that first morning, finishing right as the sun climbed fully above the horizon. A sense of relief coursed through me. If the worst happened, at least we'd have a clear path out. My plan was to put up another dozen or so throughout the week, then hold a quick meeting in my driveway to explain everything to the neighbors. I should have known this idea wouldn't sit well with certain people, especially with her. Late that afternoon, as I was trimming some dead branches near my fence, I heard a car engine rev. I glanced up to see a silver SUV, one I'd recognized from around the neighborhood. It rolled to a stop near my driveway. The driver's window slid down, revealing the disapproving face of Ms. Erica Wilson, though no one ever called her that. She was, for all intents and purposes, the HOA Karen of our quiet community. I paused, hands still gripping the pruning shears. Karen took off her oversized sunglasses, revealing narrowed eyes fixed on me. "Dana," she said in a crisp, clipped voice. "I see you've been decorating the neighborhood." My heart rate picked up. "Hello to you, too," I managed, forcing a friendly tone. "You mean the evacuation signs, right?" She sniffed. "Yes. The HOA board never approved them. I'm sure you're aware there's a process for any sort of installation that affects curb appeal." She said curb appeal like it was sacred scripture. I inhaled slowly, reminding myself to keep calm. These signs are for a critical safety measure. The fire marshal's team and the city said we can place them on private property and easements. This is about potential evacuation if the wildfire spreads. Karen gave a tight, condescending smile. "I appreciate your concern, but the HOA has very specific guidelines about signage. We can't just let random yard decorations pop up everywhere. Now can we? I started to respond, but she cut me off. I'll be taking this up with the board. Expect a notice in your mailbox soon. With that, she threw the SUV into gear and sped off, leaving my nerves buzzing with anxiety. I'd heard about her from neighbors, how she'd once threatened to fine an elderly couple for having a potted cactus that extended half an inch over the property line. But this was the first time I'd personally felt her ire. Little did I know, that moment was just the faintest rumble of thunder before the real storm. 2 days later, the smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, carried by the wind from the wildfire creeping closer. The news reports showed big red swaths on the map, just a few ridgelines over. Though we weren't in immediate danger yet, the city had elevated our status to a ready, set, go alert. My neighbors seemed on edge. Some were already packing valuables or scanning the sky at twilight for signs of an orange glow. I pressed on with my project, planting more signs along the main exit route, each labeled in bright lettering so they'd be easily visible even in poor light. My plan included small reflective arrows so that if it was dark or smoky, you could still follow the glint. Some folks honked or waved encouragingly as they passed, but every so often, I'd spot Karen driving by or walking her pampered terrier, eyeing me with undisguised contempt. That afternoon, I found a folded piece of paper in my mailbox. No postage, just a single typed page from the HOA. It stated that any signage not approved through the official HOA submission process would be considered a violation of community standards, subject to immediate removal and possible fines. Right at the bottom, it was signed, Erica Wilson, Enforcement Committee Chair. Enforcement Committee Chair? I nearly laughed. According to the official HOA roster, that role alternated among volunteers. I had no idea Karen had snagged that position, but it seemed this was no idle threat. If anything, she'd just confirmed she intended to make good on her vow. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed the city's non-emergency hotline, connecting to the fire marshal's office. I spoke with a staff member there, explaining the situation. The HOA was threatening to remove or fine me for the evacuation signs. The staffer sounded flabbergasted. We've been encouraging neighborhoods to post these. I'll let the marshal know. This can't be right. I hung up, relief mixing with dread. The city might back me up, but Karen was no slouch at doubling down. Deep down, I sensed a confrontation was brewing. That very evening, just after dusk, I was inside watching the local news coverage of the expanding fire lines when scouts started barking furiously in the yard. I opened the front door to investigate and froze at the sight of a figure yanking my newly placed sign from the corner of my lawn. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping down onto the porch. My porch light revealed the culprit, Karen herself, dressed in a perfectly pressed blouse and slacks, as if she'd just come from some fancy dinner party. Her hair was pinned back in a style that made her look even more severe. She whipped around, startled. Then her expression hardened. "Dana, these are unapproved," she barked. "I warned you. I told you the HOA has rules, and you can't do that." I cut her off, marching closer. Adrenaline spiked my pulse. She was literally holding my sign, the wood half splintered from the effort. "This is private property. These signs are for public safety." Karen scoffed. "You think you can wave public safety around like a magic wand to break every bylaw in the book? Not in my neighborhood. The board authorized me to remove them immediately. Then show me that authorization in writing." I countered, crossing my arms to keep them from shaking in anger. "Because the city said it's legal for me to post these. This is about a wildfire, Ms. Wilson, not petty aesthetics." Her cheeks flushed with indignation. "We have a community standard to uphold. These bright yellow eyesores are not acceptable. They'll lower property values and panic residents unnecessarily." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Panic residents? The entire county was under a high alert for potential evacuation. People didn't need a sign to remind them that we were in the middle of a crisis. But apparently, Karen had decided that controlling the look of the neighborhood was more important than ensuring everyone's safety. "You need to leave," I said firmly. "You are trespassing, and you're vandalizing my property." Karen clutched the sign to her chest, her voice icy. "Fine, but I'm taking this with me, and I'll be taking the rest of them, too, if you don't remove them by tomorrow morning." She turned on her heel and marched off, leaving me stunned in the gloom. My head spun, torn between fury and disbelief. As I looked at the ragged hole in the ground where she'd yanked my sign, a single thought flickered in my mind. This is not over. By morning, I found 3 more of my signs had gone missing, likely torn down in the wee hours. When I discovered fresh footprints near one of them, my suspicions confirmed who was behind it. I wasn't sure how to fight back. The HOA had an official process for disputes, but that could take weeks. Meanwhile, the wildfire threat was growing. The local news now showed the flames creeping closer day by day, devouring acres of brush. The sky over the hills was turning a hazy brown during the afternoons. Determined, I decided to rally my neighbors. I printed small flyers titled Neighborhood Evacuation Meeting and taped them to community bulletin boards, slipped them under doors, and posted them on our local online forum. The meeting would happen that weekend, right in my driveway. I promised to go over the route, pass out copies of the city's emergency instructions, and answer questions. A few days later, about 20 people showed up, families, some single folks, a couple in their 70s. Even a handful of teenagers trudged over, presumably at their parents' insistence. Chairs were set up in a semicircle around my garage door. The morning was bright, scorching already at 9 o'clock, but folks seemed eager to hear about the plan. I explained the path I'd mapped out with the city's guidance, showing how to quickly exit the neighborhood and merge onto the main road. I also detailed how to handle potential blockades or heavy smoke. People nodded and took notes. A few asked me to clarify certain side streets or safe meeting points. I pointed to a large map pinned to a corkboard. I originally posted signs at each critical intersection, I said, so no one would get lost even if visibility was low. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Someone in the back raised their hand. What happened to them? I saw a couple a week ago, but now they're gone. I exchanged a knowing glance with my friend, Adam, who lived 2 doors down. Yes, well, some were removed, I said carefully. By the HOA, or at least by someone claiming to represent them. Disapproving grumbles spread. That's ridiculous, one woman said. We need them. Everyone knows the fire is edging closer. Another neighbor shook his head in dismay. Figures. Erica Wilson's behind this, isn't she? I can't count how many times she's complained about nonsense. My fence was an inch too high, apparently. At that moment, as if summoned by mention of her name, I saw Karen strolling down the sidewalk, arms folded. She came to a stop near the edge of my driveway. Her lips were pressed together, and her eyes darted over the group, like a hawk surveying potential prey. Dana, she said in a loud, ringing tone, I believe you did not request HOA approval for this gathering. She gestured vaguely at the chairs and the map. A hush fell. I took a step forward, trying to maintain composure. This is just an informational meeting about wildfire safety, Ms. Wilson, I replied. I don't need approval to have neighbors on my own property discussing a public safety emergency. She gave a condescending smile. We do have rules about large events. Parking restrictions, noise ordinances. We're not blocking any driveways, Adam interjected, his voice firm. We're not creating noise. It's barely 9 in the morning. Give it a rest. A flush crept up Karen's neck. A few stifled giggles rippled among the neighbors. She cleared her throat, turning her attention back to me. Are you planning to distribute more of those garish signs? I bristled. They're not garish. They're official city-sanctioned route markers. And yes, I plan to repost them. Her eyes narrowed. Then expect them to be removed if they appear on any communal property. She straightened her shoulders and raised her voice to address the entire group. I'm sorry to say this, but the last thing we need is to make the neighborhood look like a carnival while scaring off potential homebuyers. Gasps and mutters followed. People started shaking their heads. One older gentleman stood up, voice trembling with anger. Scaring off homebuyers? If a fire is near, we have a real threat to worry about, not some imaginary property value fiasco. Karen made a haughty expression. I understand you're concerned, Mr. Chester, but we have guidelines for signage. We can't just ignore them because someone feels anxious. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, but I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the crowd's support. I placed a hand on Mr. Chester's shoulder. Thank you, sir. And Ms. Wilson, if you continue to remove or destroy my signs on my private property or legally permitted easements, you'll be in direct violation of city codes and the fire marshal's recommendations. She gave a dismissive wave. We shall see about that, she said, spinning around and marching away. A heavy tension weighed over the group. Eventually, conversation resumed, and we managed to end on a note of solidarity. Many neighbors promised to keep an eye out for sign vandals, and several volunteers offered to help me repost them. But inside, I felt uneasy. Karen was no pushover, and I had a strong suspicion this was going to escalate even further. 2 nights later, the crisp beep of my phone woke me around 2 a.m. I'd installed a security camera above my garage that sent alerts if it detected motion in the driveway. Groggy and half asleep, I checked the camera feed. The screen showed a figure creeping along the sidewalk, heading toward one of my newly replaced signs. In the faint glow of a street lamp, it looked suspiciously like Karen's silhouette. Same haircut, same posture. I watched, heart pounding, as the person yanked at the sign. The wood wobbled. Then, as if deciding it was too firmly staked, they pulled out a small hammer or crowbar to pry it loose. Within seconds, my sign was gone, and the figure disappeared into the night. I downloaded the footage, rage boiling in my veins. She was tearing down crucial safety markers that could literally save someone's life if the fire advanced. This was no longer just a petty annoyance. It was sabotage. I wanted to call the police right then and there. But it was late, and I had no definitive proof of her face. So I left a message with the fire marshal's office, attaching a copy of the video. The marshal, Devin Peterson, was aware of the ongoing friction. The staffer I spoke with a few days ago had assured me they were taking note. All the same, I decided to do one better. I posted the video on our private neighborhood forum with a caption, "Caught on camera, HOA member removing official evacuation sign." I blurred the figure's face in case any legal issues arose, but it was still obvious who it was to anyone who knew her. My phone blew up with reactions, some outraged, some empathizing, and a few that were suspiciously quiet, likely Karen's close allies. Sure enough, within an hour, Karen replied in the thread with a long, indignant post. She claimed the sign in question was an illegal eyesore placed too close to the street, thus violating an arcane local code. She threatened to sue me for public defamation. She insisted she was protecting the neighborhood's image and that I was fear-mongering. The comments section lit up with both condemnation and support for me. A neighbor named Lucy wrote, "These fires are real. My cousin's home 2 towns away just got evacuated. This isn't fear-mongering. This is saving lives." Another person jumped in. "Karen, you can't break the law under the guise of HOA rules." I felt a small measure of vindication that people were seeing the lengths to which Karen would go. But part of me worried. This was a person with real power in the HOA structure, and she was demonstrating zero respect for official mandates or even basic decency. Early the next day, I received a call from Fire Marshal Devin Peterson. He sounded both livid and incredulous. "I reviewed the footage you sent," he said, "and I also saw the follow-up on your neighborhood forum. I can't believe anyone would tear down an emergency sign in the middle of a wildfire alert." I exhaled in relief. Finally, some official backup. "Thank you for taking this seriously," I replied. I wasn't sure what else to do. Peterson explained that city law allows for emergency signage without HOA interference. He even cited a municipal code that states local government ordinances regarding safety supersede any private association rules. If the HOA or its representatives are removing these signs, that's actually an offense we can fine them for, he said firmly. "I'll be filing a formal complaint on behalf of the fire department." A weight lifted from my shoulders. At last, Karen's arrogance might face real consequences. "What do you recommend I do in the meantime?" I asked. "Keep replacing them," he said. "Take photos, document everything, and if she, or anyone else, tries to remove them again, call the non-emergency line. We'll escalate as necessary." He paused, voice tinged with frustration. "This is public safety we're talking about. I'm appalled that you're dealing with this nonsense instead of focusing on preparing for potential evacuation." After hanging up, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I texted Adam and a few other supportive neighbors, sharing the good news. The fire marshal had our backs. That night, we fanned out with signs, resecuring them into the ground with longer stakes, even adding reflective tape. With the city on our side, it felt like we had a fighting chance. Yet something in my gut told me Karen wouldn't just roll over and accept defeat. While the battle over the signs raged on, the wildfire itself was creeping steadily nearer. The local news stations broadcast images of thick, billowing smoke, and families just 5 miles east of US had been placed under mandatory evacuation. Our county's emergency alert system pinged phones with frequent updates, cautioning everyone to stay vigilant. One late afternoon, as I stood on my porch, I could actually see a faint glow in the distance, orange and flickering against the smoky sky. My stomach lurched. It was real. This wasn't a drill or a hypothetical scenario. Flames were out there, and if the winds shifted, we might be next. Neighbors began preparing in earnest, packing up family photos, important documents, extra water. On my street, people talked about when, not if, we might have to leave. And yet, unbelievably, Karen still championed her crusade to maintain the aesthetic integrity of our streets. That night, I saw a post from her on the neighborhood forum. "Stop the sign pollution. It's causing anxiety." The text read like a rant. "These giant, glaring signs are doing more harm than good, alarming children and elders. We're not guaranteed the fire will reach us. Let's focus on normalcy rather than fueling panic." I was half tempted to reply with some sarcastic remark about how normalcy wouldn't help if the flames actually arrived. But I restrained myself. The fire marshal's formal complaint was in progress, and I didn't want to stoop to an online shouting match. Karen's response? She posted a rebuttal letter on the HOA bulletin, claiming the city had no right to infringe on private property regulations. She pointed to sections of the HOA bylaws that mentioned excessive signage and aesthetic uniformity, twisting them to justify her crusade. But most folks could see she was on thin ice. Even her usual allies grew quiet. Some, who initially grumbled about the bright signs, realized the stakes. Going up against a city ordinance about wildfire safety was a losing battle. I noticed fewer signs disappearing in the following days, which gave me hope that maybe Karen was backing down. But that hope didn't last long. One evening, I was almost asleep when my phone buzzed with a text from Adam. He'd caught someone on his security camera trying to yank out the sign at the end of his lawn. In the grainy footage, it was obviously Karen, her distinct silhouette, the same posture as before. This time, she had a small group of accomplices, 2 other women from the HOA known for being in Karen's tight-knit circle. They wrested the sign from the ground, then stuffed it into the trunk of a car. In the reflection of the car's brake lights, you could see Karen's face for a split second. Adam's follow-up text read, "I'm calling the fire department's non-emergency line. This is insane." I jumped out of bed, adrenaline surging, and turned on my own security feed. No immediate action outside my house, but I sat in the glow of the monitor, half expecting them to show up and snatch my signs too. About 15 minutes later, I spotted headlights creeping down the street. The vehicle halted near my yard for a tense moment, but eventually drove off. My guess was they saw the cameras, got spooked, and decided to bail. A short while after that, a police cruiser arrived, probably responding to Adam's call. They patrolled the block, shining flashlights around. By the time the officers came to my door, I was wide awake, teeth clenched with anger. I showed them my footage and shared the backstory. The officers agreed to file a report, though it wasn't a high-priority emergency. Still, they said they'd forward everything to the fire department. With that, I tried to get some rest, though my mind raced with frustrations and what-ifs. Word of that late-night vandalism spread like wildfire of its own. By morning, the entire community was buzzing. Adam posted the camera footage to the forum, labeling it "caught red-handed." If Karen thought she could keep her identity hidden, she was sorely mistaken. The video left little doubt. The face illuminated by the car's brake lights was hers. Residents who were on the fence about the sign drama now openly condemned her. Even those who had previously disliked the bright signage began to see how reckless and illegal her actions were. Karen attempted damage control, claiming she was protecting property values. She insisted the signs were not officially authorized by the entire HOA. But more and more neighbors were replying with condemnation. "How dare you remove signs that could help in an emergency? My daughter has asthma. If there's smoke, we need the quickest route out. Hope you have the money for those fines, Karen." Meanwhile, the wildfire threat loomed. The city declared a local state of emergency. The evacuation zone was creeping closer, with strong winds predicted for the next few days. Winds that could blow embers toward our neighborhood. Everyone was on edge, and they were furious that our so-called HOA enforcement chair was undermining the very safety measures we needed. A couple of days later, at around noon, A bright red fire department SUV rolled down our street and stopped in front of Karen's house. I watched through my living room window, heart pounding. Out stepped Fire Marshal Devin Peterson himself, accompanied by a uniformed police officer carrying a clipboard. They marched up to Karen's front door and knocked. Curiosity got the better of me, so I peeked out, stepping onto my porch. It wasn't long before half the block was sneaking glances from their windows or vantage points behind hedges. Karen opened her door, her expression going from annoyance to alarm when she saw the official presence. From my distance, I couldn't make out every word, but I caught snippets. Violation of municipal code. Substantial fines for obstructing safety measures. Require immediate restitution. Karen's face blanched, then turned beet red. She waved her arms, looking outraged, while the marshal and police officer remained impassive. Their conversation lasted several minutes. When it ended, Karen retreated into her house, slamming the door. The officer pinned something, a notice, on her front entrance. Then they walked back to their SUV. I got a text from Adam. Looks like she just got slapped with a fine or a summons. I nodded to myself. It was about time Karen faced real consequences. Yet I didn't dare celebrate too soon. People like her often doubled down when cornered. That evening, the HOA board had a special emergency meeting. Typically, these gatherings were stuffy affairs in a small conference room next to the community pool, with a handful of folks half listening to budgets and landscaping proposals. But this time, the room was packed. People were hungry for answers and for accountability. I arrived early, wearing jeans and a simple blouse, determined to keep my composure no matter what. Karen was already there, perched behind the board table. She looked frazzled, scanning the crowd with tight lips. Other board members flanked her, appearing uncomfortably aware of the tension. Mr. Kaplan, the board president, cleared his throat. We're here to discuss the matter of the emergency evacuation signage and recent events related to their removal. His tone was stiff, official. We understand that city authorities and the fire department have mandated these signs remain in place due to the ongoing wildfire threat. Let's keep this civil. A low murmur spread through the audience. Karen clasped her hands in front of her. I'd like to speak first, she said, standing. I believe the HOA's guidelines on signage are being blatantly disregarded. The bright color, the reflective surfaces, they're unsightly and cause undue alarm. We had an agreement that any sign must be pre-approved by the architectural committee. Before she could continue, a neighbor shot up from the front row. Excuse me, but did the city's letter not make it clear that these signs are exempt from HOA restrictions? They're for public safety, not decoration. A ripple of applause followed, and Karen's face tightened. She pressed her lips into a thin line. I understand that's their stance, but we have a say in how our neighborhood looks. People are stressed enough without being forced to stare at these big, glaring warnings every time they drive in. I couldn't stay silent. Ms. Wilson, have you read the local news? The wildfire is less than 5 miles away. This is real. And these signs are specifically recommended by the fire marshal to guide people out safely. Aesthetics shouldn't matter more than lives. Another wave of murmurs echoed. Karen gave me a look that could curdle milk. Dana, you're sensationalizing this. The city has a duty to warn us, yes, but the method should still respect community guidelines. Mr. Kaplan attempted to restore order, tapping his gavel. Let's remain respectful. The matter at hand is the legality of removing or defacing these emergency signs. He cleared his throat. We received notice that Ms. Wilson has been cited for violating a city ordinance regarding tampering with safety signage. It's come to our attention that if these actions continue, the HOA itself could be held liable. Karen's knuckles whitened. You're blaming me for trying to keep our neighborhood from looking like a crisis zone, she hissed. Kaplan gave a weary sigh. No one is blaming you for wanting a pleasant environment, Ms. Wilson. But the city's mandate overrides any aesthetic concerns. We can't risk the safety of residents, nor can we risk legal action against the association. More applause broke out. A mother in the back raised her hand. My family moved here because we believed it was a safe neighborhood. The idea that an HOA member is removing official signs is beyond comprehension. Karen tried to interrupt, but Mr. Kaplan tapped the gavel again. Ms. Wilson, the board has reviewed the city code and the footage. We find your actions in direct violation. The fire marshal's report states that you removed or attempted to remove multiple signs on multiple occasions. A hush filled the room. Karen's eyes darted left and right, searching for an ally. But few looked willing to defend her. Even the board members who were typically her supporters seemed to avoid her gaze. Kaplan continued, until further notice, the board is suspending your authority to enforce sign-related bylaws. Additionally, we're instructing you to restore or replace any signs you've removed at your own expense. Karen's mouth dropped open, face turning crimson. She looked on the verge of protest, but Kaplan added, moreover, the city's letter states they may impose daily fines for each sign removed. These fines could total thousands of dollars if not remedied. We strongly advise you to comply. A stunned silence. Then a smattering of claps and nods of approval spread through the onlookers. I could see Karen's shoulders tremble with rage. If eyes could shoot flames, she would have burned the entire building down in that instant. But faced with an official rebuke, she seemed paralyzed, unsure how to twist the situation to her advantage. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with the crowd milling about, discussing the shocking scene. I walked out feeling a sense of vindication, relief mixed with lingering worry. Knowing Karen, this might not be the end. But it was a significant victory for all of us who valued safety over superficial concerns. In the days that followed, rumors flew that Karen had hired a lawyer to contest the city's mandate. Another story claimed she planned to host a private HOA session, excluding me and my supporters. But none of these rumors materialized into anything concrete. The threat of fines up to $1,000 per sign removed was a powerful deterrent, apparently even for her. Our neighborhood, meanwhile, grew more anxious about the wildfire. Plumes of smoke were visible at times, and an acrid smell hung in the evening air. Streets were quieter than usual, as some families chose to stay elsewhere in safer zones. The reflection of flames at night had grown more pronounced, painting the sky with a faint, eerie glow. One windy afternoon, I stepped outside to find Karen trudging down the sidewalk. She had a bundle of bright yellow signs cradled in her arms, each sporting the bold text, "Emergency Evacuation Route." My signs. Or at least, replacements she'd presumably been forced to obtain. We locked eyes. Neither of us said a word. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a stiff posture as she hammered one sign back into the exact spot she'd torn it from weeks prior. A neighbor walked by, giving me a thumbs up and Karen a wary glance. The air brimmed with tension, but at least the signs were being restored. She repeated this process up the street, placing the signs in their rightful places. Part of me felt triumphant, seeing her forced to undo the very damage she'd inflicted. But another part felt a pang of empathy. Sometimes, pride can lead us down destructive paths. Perhaps she'd reflect on this lesson. Perhaps not. As if the saga weren't intense enough, the wildfire made its most dramatic move a few nights later. A sudden shift in the Santa Ana winds pushed the flames dangerously close to a ravine near our neighborhood. Around 8 p.m., our phone screeched with a citywide emergency alert. Mandatory evacuation order for our neighborhood name. Leave immediately. My adrenaline spiked. I grabbed Scout's leash, my backpack of essentials, and the box of important documents I'd kept by the door. Outside, the street was already abuzz with headlights, neighbors calling out to each other, some loading pets and valuables into cars. That's when I realized. The route. The signs. My plan from weeks before was now about to be tested in real life. Anxiety knotted my stomach, but I felt a grim sense of determination. This was exactly why I'd fought so hard to keep those markers up. I hopped into my car, Scout beside me, and eased out onto the road. Even in the darkness, the bright yellow evacuation signs were unmistakable, arrows glinting in the reflection of every passing headlight. Horns honked politely as cars navigated the route, guided by the signage. Occasionally, brake lights flared as people turned onto the main roads, but the process flowed more smoothly than I'd expected. No frantic guesswork, no random U-turns. As I rounded a corner toward the neighborhood exit, I caught a glimpse of Karen's SUV up ahead. She was stopped at one intersection, hazard lights blinking. My heart pounded with worry. Was she in trouble? My moral sense told me to check. I pulled up behind her, lowered my window. "Ms. Wilson? Are you okay?" She was hunched over her steering wheel, phone in hand, tears in her eyes. My sister was supposed to come help me, but I can't get through to her. The roads are so chaotic, and she glanced at the bright sign with an arrow pointing left. I'm not sure which way. I know I put these signs back, but despite everything, I felt a surge of empathy. We were both anxious, both facing the same danger. "Follow the signs," I said gently. "They'll lead us right to the main thoroughfare. Then we can turn onto the freeway heading north. You'll be safe." She nodded, gripping the steering wheel. Okay. Thank you." She sniffled, flicked off her hazards, and slowly started forward. Within half an hour, we streamed into a nearby evacuation center set up at a local high school. The gymnasium bustled with evacuees from multiple neighborhoods. Cots lined the walls, volunteers distributed bottled water and blankets. I found a spot near a corner, trying to calm Scout, who was trembling with anxiety. As I settled onto a cot, who should walk in but Karen, shoulders slumped, scanning the area. She spotted me, hesitated, then approached. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The buzz of anxious chatter and distant helicopter blades underscored the surreal moment. Finally, Karen cleared her throat. "Dana, I." She paused, eyes flickering around. "I guess we should be grateful for those signs tonight." I studied her expression. She looked genuinely shaken, possibly embarrassed. This was the first time I'd seen her without her usual armor of icy composure. I nodded slowly. "I'm just glad everyone's getting out okay." She opened her mouth, closed it again, then offered a stiff half-smile. "Yes, me too." That was it. No grand apology, no heartfelt confession of wrongdoing. But in her eyes, I saw a flicker of remorse. Maybe she realized she'd been so fixated on rules and appearances that she'd jeopardized actual safety. We parted ways. The rest of the night was a blur of updates from the fire department, hearing about how close the flames got to our block, how valiantly the firefighters worked to contain it. At one point, I dozed off, head spinning with relief and exhaustion. By dawn, the wildfire's progress had halted. The heroic efforts of the firefighting teams, combined with a shift in the winds, spared our neighborhood. We were allowed to return late the next morning. The drive back was surreal. Our streets blanketed in ash, air thick with residual smoke, but our homes still standing. In the distance, scorched hillsides served as a stark reminder of how close we'd come. My evacuation signs, many of them still firmly in place, were now iconic symbols of last night's frantic exodus. Their bright yellow frames were dusted with ash, but the arrows remained legible. A group of neighbors stood near one intersection, talking in hushed voices about how thankful they were for the route markers. Karen's SUV was parked in her driveway. She was outside, brushing ash off her mailbox. When she saw me, she lowered her eyes momentarily, then nodded. "Welcome home," she offered quietly, voice subdued. A small, surprising warmth flickered in my chest. Maybe, in the face of something bigger than all of us, the petty differences began to fade. Maybe not entirely, but enough to foster a sense of shared gratitude that we in our houses were still here. In the following weeks, the community began its slow return to normalcy. The HOA board convened again, partially to assess any damages and partially to address leftover disputes. Karen was still on the enforcement committee, but her power had waned. Everyone knew she'd been fined. Although the exact amount wasn't public, rumors said it was several $1,000s, maybe more, considering each sign removed constituted a separate violation. The fire marshal's office issued a statement praising the effectiveness of the posted signs during the evacuation. Local news outlets ran a short segment on how one neighborhood's early planning helped a smooth exit. I was interviewed briefly, and I made sure to mention the volunteers who helped post signs, as well as the supportive neighbors who recognized their value. As for Karen, the city compelled her to write a formal letter, an admission of wrongdoing, to close out the matter. The letter circulated among the HOA membership. While it didn't include the words, "I'm sorry," it did acknowledge her actions contravened city ordinances and would not be repeated. In the end, that was probably as close to an apology as we'd get. A month later, the board held another vote, and Karen lost her seat as enforcement committee chair. A wave of new volunteers stepped in, determined to keep the HOA from becoming a tool for personal vendettas. Some folks whispered that Karen might sell her home and move, but she stayed put, more low-profile than before. One morning, I headed out to retrieve my mail and found Karen at the curb, unboxing groceries from her car. She struggled with an overstuffed paper bag. Without overthinking it, I walked over to help. We lifted it together onto the sidewalk. A single can of soup toppled out, rolling into the street. I jogged to pick it up. Karen murmured a quiet, "Thank you," gaze still a bit wary, but notably less hostile. Her expression softened. "We got lucky, you know, with the fire." I swallowed, thinking of the scorched terrain that began just half a mile away. "Yeah, we did," I agreed. "If the wind hadn't changed." She hesitated, fiddling with the handle of the grocery bag. "Those signs, they really did help that night." especially for those of us not used to driving in smoke or chaos. I mustered a small smile. I'm just glad the plan worked. Karen's eyes flickered with unspoken regrets. Right? She said softly, then turned to head back toward her garage. A few seconds later, she looked over her shoulder. All right. Have a good day, Dana. It wasn't a redemption arc straight out of a movie, but it felt like a meaningful step. The friction between us had cooled from a raging inferno to faint embers. And that was enough. We would likely never be friends, but maybe we could coexist in relative peace. After all, we both witnessed just how quickly everything can go up in flames. Several months later, life in our little cul-de-sac found a new equilibrium. Charred slopes in the distance began to show green shoots of recovery. The city ramped up efforts to educate residents about wildfire preparedness, and I continued volunteering to help distribute materials. My bright yellow signs remained posted, now with official city signage backing them up, ensuring no one would dare tear them down again. The HOA, too, evolved. They updated their bylaws to clarify that any city-mandated emergency measure supersedes HOA rules. No more ambiguous property value justifications could override public safety. Attendance at HOA meetings rose, with more diverse voices stepping forward to keep the neighborhood balanced rather than letting one person dominate. And Karen? She became notably less vocal in public forums. Once or twice, I spotted her gently redirecting a neighbor who parked incorrectly or letting someone know the best day to put out the trash. The tone was still a bit controlling, but it lacked the harshness from before. Perhaps her brush with real danger and the legal repercussions had tempered her approach. I often reflect on how close we came to a major tragedy. The winds that night might have blown embers into our backyards, burning everything in sight. If that had happened, would Karen have stuck to her aesthetic guns? Would others have followed her lead, risking their lives? I shudder at the thought. Sometimes, adversity forces us to prioritize what truly matters. In the end, the wildfire served as a stark reminder that community means more than just a pretty facade. It means banding together in times of crisis, trusting one another, and respecting the greater good over personal preference. So that's the tale of how the HOA Karen of our neighborhood tried to tear down life-saving evacuation signs and ended up facing the fiery backlash of the fire marshal and of common sense. It was dramatic, stressful, and at times downright surreal. But justice and safety ultimately prevailed. To anyone listening or reading along, there may always be a Karen in your midst, someone who puts rules or personal comfort above the well-being of others. Yet with perseverance, community support, and a healthy respect for what truly keeps us safe, we can stand our ground. We can make a difference, one bright yellow sign at a time.